together my own opinion on it, based on multiple.
All right, let's come back together. Okay, so this is our part 2 of how to study the Bible. We're probably doing one of the hardest parts, maybe the first most difficult or the second most difficult topic probably in the Bible, which is the New Testament letters. The reason why I'm saying that is because there's a lot of different difficult topics in the Bible that in 2022 a lot of people disagree with. Okay, so a couple of things they talk about. For example, homosexuality is a sin. Already, like you lose a lot of people here. You're just like, okay, that's why I don't read the Bible, because it's so old or it's so backwards, things like that. Okay, and then if I haven't lost you here, I'm gonna lose half the audience here. Okay, woman needs to submit to their husband. Okay, lost all the girls here. Okay, so again, these are all in what we call the epistles or the letters of Paul and Peter, okay, in the New Testament. But it's going to continue. Women should not speak or become leaders at church. Okay? Slavery is not condemned. They don't condone it, but they don't condemn it either. So we're going to talk about that more. Like today, the verse that we're going to read, it's about slavery. Okay? And the next ones are kind of problematic for Seventh-day Adventists, not for other churches. But for example, there's some letters where it seems like Paul says, hey, all food is good. It's okay. Okay? Or wine is okay. Okay? As long as you don't get drunk. And then they also say Sabbath is not important either. Again, all of these are very, very difficult matters. Okay? Whether you live in, again, 2022, in this world and age, you don't say these kind of things. And also, at SDA, if you're Seventh-day Adventist, these are all problematic as well. Because conservative SDAs are going to say, no, these are absolutely all correct. But again, these are all arguments that you can make from the letters of Paul. Okay, so but again, we have to be very careful in how we read this thing. Because Paul's letter wasn't written for us. It was written to very specific people. So how do we actually learn to interpret Paul's letters? That's what we're going over. Okay, how do we go over some of these things? All right. So let's go over it. First, it is necessary to know that epistles themselves are not homogeneous lot. So they're not the same, basically. There's a distinction between letters, which is for specific people, and then epistles, which is for the public. The examples of epistles, for example, James, Hebrew, 1 John. Okay? And we know that they're letters because they specify, like, hey, like Abel, to Abel, then that's a very specific person. But if I say to the church living in Dallas Central, then that's that's a group of people, not specific people. So we have to understand there's differences in that. The validity of this distinction may be seen by noting the form of ancient letters. Just as there is standard form of our letters or emails when we make emails, okay? The letter form usually consists of 6 parts. These are not always present, but it's, you see this form. Okay, ready? And so if you're taking notes, again, the difference between letter and epistle, that was number 1. And number 2, these are the 6 parts of a letter. Number 1, the name of the writer, name of the recipient, greeting, prayer, wish, thanksgiving, and then the main, what's the body, main part, and then final greeting and farewell. Okay, so if you want to see an example of that, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And if you go to Hebrews, again, these are going to be very, very different. And so later I'm going to give you an example, and we're going to do one together to see if it's a letter or an epistle. Okay? But it's pretty clear when you read. So 1 Corinthians, again, he says, this is Paul, apostle, the slave of God. And then he goes over all of these things to the letter to the church of Corinth. Okay? So it's very specific. Whereas Hebrew, no introduction, no nothing. Okay? He just goes on. So you could kind of see the difference. And so again, we have to first distinguish, was it a letter to a very specific person or was it a group of people? Okay, that's going to be important. Okay, let's go to the next one. Abel, if you don't mind reading the second part for us.
Despite this variety of kinds, there is one item that all of the epistles have in common, and this is a crucial item to note in the reading and interpreting them. They are all what are technically called occasional documents. They are all from the first century, which makes their interpretation difficult. This is why careful exegesis is needed.
Okay, so again, we talked about this before, but again, these letters were not written to people in 2022. Okay, it was written to people in the first century. So that means we have to understand the first century. Okay, and that's what that's called exegesis. Okay, without doing this and you just go, oh, how dare you say that, Paul? Well, he wasn't in 2022. That's why he says it. Okay, maybe he would have said it a little bit differently. Okay, but again, we have to understand them first. Let's keep going. Pastor Justin, if you don't mind reading this for us.
Yeah. Most of our problems interpreting the epistles are due to the fact that of there being occasion from the reader's side. We have the answers, but we do not always know the questions or problems. Or it is much like hearing one end of a telephone conversation and trying to figure out who is on the other end and what that unseen party is saying. Yet in many cases, it is especially important for us to try to hear the other end so that we know what our passage is a response.
So let's start with the illustration. Have you guys ever been you're with somebody else in the room, or you're having food with somebody at a restaurant, and then your friend picks up the phone and they have a conversation. But what's the problem? The problem is that you only hear what your friend is saying in front of you. So what do you try to do? You try to like you're trying to see what they're talking about. And sometimes you're like dead on. You know exactly what they're talking about. But sometimes it's like you don't know what's going on at all. And so you interpreted it totally wrong. So in these letters, that's what we're doing. And so that's why we got to be careful, because we only get to hear Paul's side of the story or Peter's side of the story. So like this church had a problem. And so they write to Paul. They go, oh, we need help here. And then Paul writes a letter. But we don't know exactly what the problems were. Does that make sense? Now, we're going to get some hints of it from here, but we have to be very careful because we're only hearing one side. Does that make sense? Okay. And we obviously don't have Paul or Peter to ask them, like, what was the specific thing? We don't know. So, but within the letters, there's some hints and things like that we can get a glimpse of. And some things we'll just 100% we'll know. Okay? And again, that's why we have different scholars, different pastors saying different things. Because we don't know. Some of these things we have to make a jump. All right, so we're going to do very, very simple, okay, exegesis together. Okay? You guys can all do it. I know these it looks like big words, but you guys can do it. Okay, let's all go to the book of Philippians. It's only one chapter, so that's why I picked it. Okay? So if you have your phone, it's in the back of the Bible. Okay? So scroll down all the way. It's after Titus and before Hebrews. So again, I want you to read it. Okay? I want you to identify whether it's a letter or an epistle. Write down your own summary and make kind of an outline of the book. Okay? I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes to do that. Okay? And then if you have any questions, then just talk to me. No, Philemon. The book of Philemon. Yeah, it's only one chapter. Okay. It's just one chapter. That's it. And then if you're finished, then with people next to you guys, kind of compare to see if you guys, what you guys got, how you guys summarized it, and then if that is correct, if you saw something different, what are some of the, go for it.
So this is my understanding of it. So Paul's writing a letter to a group of people and a church as well. And I guess perhaps Timothy has complained about it. So Paul, so now together, it seems like Paul, and Timothy are writing to you. Yeah, this is what's going on. To spread the good news. Even though I'm a prisoner for spreading the good news, you know, you still.
Timothy was his sidekick.
Yeah. That's what. That's my understanding too. Yeah. It's like, hey man, it's like, you know, like what's going on? You know, like, you know, even at level I'm struggling. You know, for spreading good news, you might have to endure this to this well. So
Look at how short that was. Because that's more or less recently.
It's still like the church that meets
Probably
there.
like that's not appropriate.
From a lot of
It's heard that this one paid me.
the latter part of Paul's
Yeah,
life,
and this does have the same.
his eyes weren't too good. So, and this is what I heard. So like he had to help
I
out.
didn't say
But
Onesimus?
something he had to help.
I mean, that's what it is. Like, remember, like people with like what they're hanging their ears.
At least I'm not
it's being ridiculous.
Just threw a bunch of people.
I don't know if that was still probably not.
I can nail
I don't know, probably not.
Just give me like
They get so
30
old.
seconds.
We gotta live through you.
I was really good with Polish. It's all constant.
That's one thing. What would you say would be like a short summary?
The short summary.
I'm not sure if he liberated him here. He said, hey, you know, this guy was a slave and I met him in prison, so, you know, type things. Kind of just converted him over. So he says, kind of take him back, but like not just as a slave.
He's definitely speaking.
And so later on, it says on here,
Spreading, you know, the good
if
news.
he has wronged you or owes you anything, he says, put it on my account, like, I'll pay for it.
And
So the
outline follows
either
those.
Leviticus or Deuteronomy, there is a statute of limitations for someone keeping a slave in bondage. And if they want to continue on by the end of their 7th year, they have to make that known. You have to go to
There's definitely agreeing.
a priest, get
The name of the
before
writer,
priest, and
the
then
recipient.
get a gold earring, signifying that they're free to continue on in bondage
Wishing them
towards you, but
say,
as
oh,
somebody who wanted to outright,
Farewell.
does specifically to Jews, only other Jews.
yeah, it's got which is the story of somebody.
No, Philemon, Sophia,
He's in bondage to remember
the care that
he got fit for
There's
this.
some form of,
Jacob.
Jacob.
I think for you.
Yeah.
So that would,
And then it goes
No, because he wasn't
into this line, right?
okay.
Yeah. This is where Matt
working for his uncle, and his uncle gave him a raw deal.
And then
And
that's
his,
it up
the other daughter, because he knew he couldn't marry her off. There's,
He always includes all these other
the
people
polite way to
that
put it,
are
the
with him.
Bible puts it in the most polite terms, she was very homely.
It's
So
almost
she was
like,
cross-eyed, and
like a
she
goof barrel.
probably
I'm writing this,
had some sort
but
of,
yeah, you got these people that are also.
so I put it also very comely,
That's something
of the
that
eyes.
needs
And she
Okay, let's come back together. I know you guys are not finished. All right, so first one. Is it a letter or an epistle?
It's a letter.
Letter.
It's a letter. Okay, how do we know that? It's very specific. It goes over all 6 elements that we went over in the letter. Okay? Who's the writer?
Paul.
Paul. Okay, who's the recipient?
Philemon.
Philemon. Okay, how do we know that? It's right there. Okay, in verse 1. Paul, prisoner of Jesus Christ, and Timothy to who? Philemon. So it tells us exactly. Okay. So this was written to who? To Philemon, specifically to him. Okay, and we're listening in on their conversation. Okay, where is Paul writing this from? Prison. How do we know?
It's
Because he literally says that. Okay, so again, these are all things that we have to understand. Okay, what are they talking about? Or what's Paul's main thing?
the good news.
No.
To take Onesimus.
Okay, there's a character name. So how does Paul and Philemon, what's their relation? What's in between? What is Paul trying to write a letter to Philemon about? About a guy named Onesimus. Where did Paul and Onesimus meet?
Jail.
In jail. Okay, why? Again, in verse 10. Okay, I want to appeal to him, my son Onesimus. I fathered him while I was in chains. So we met together in prison. Okay, so I know the language says he's my son, I'm his father. Is it literal? Is it literal? No, because again, if it was literal, he wouldn't say we met while we were. Does that make sense? So he's talking about what then? We think, we're talking about spiritual. So basically, Onesimus wasn't a Christian. They met in prison, and then basically he converted him. And so that's why he's saying father and son. We know this because we could see from other Paul's writings, he uses this kind of language. If you want to go to 1 Corinthians 5, he uses this kind of language. Okay? So again, this is why if you know more information, the better you understand. Okay? So, what do you think Paul is doing? Why is he writing to Philemon about Onesimus? Like, what does it seem like? Do you guys see in he's asking for consent. And he's saying, right here, verse 14. But I don't want to do anything without your consent. So your good deeds might be not of obligation, but your own free will. So he's saying, I need your consent. I don't want Onesimus to just stay with me just by force. I need your consent. So what kind of relationship do you think Onesimus and Philemon have?
He was a slave.
Okay, he was a slave. Okay, so from that, maybe a theory, and this is what most people think, is Onesimus was a slave of Philemon, but he ran away. Okay, how do we know that? We say here in verse 11, once he was useless to you. Okay, so perhaps either, because if Philemon just threw him away, then Paul can do whatever, right? Because he's no longer Philemon's slave. But most likely, he still needs Philemon's consent because he ran away. Okay, so we don't know the exact circumstances. Was Philemon a very bad boss? Or was Onesimus just a bad slave? We don't know. It may be both. I don't know. But he ran away, and then in prison, he met Paul. And then Paul was like, hey, he's very important supporter and partner to me. Okay? But I know that he's your slave. So I can't just take him. So I'm sending him back with this letter. And I want you to basically hand him over to me. Okay, so that's the letter. Does that make sense? All right. So all of these things, we have to, again, piece it together because we're only hearing Paul's side of the phone call. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I know this was not enough time, but that's kind of a gist of what you have to do with exegesis. Okay. Any questions, really quick questions about exegesis? Again, we have not done a lot of stuff. We just did over a very, very short time of period. But that's kind of, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of a little bit of exegesis. Okay, any questions, clarifications?
In relation to the book, this is such a short chapter.
Yeah.
Like, why did they include it in the construct of the
Sure,
Bible?
sure.
Which is like maybe in the more human piece of it.
Yeah. So first reason is probably because it was written by Paul. And I think maybe the the people who decided together, they felt like there was some kind of principle that we could learn from it, perhaps. But I think the biggest thing was that it was Paul's letter, and because he was an apostle. Like there's still a lot of actually good like principle, how we should treat one another, and another thing we have to understand is when we think of slavery, we think of like African American slavery, where like they didn't want to be slaves, and then like people went over, Europeans went over, Americans went over, and like forced them into slavery. But slavery in the Bible, of course, there was some of that, but most of the time slavery in the Bible was voluntary. Okay, because you had a debt. Okay, so what did you do? You sold yourself, and so you worked for the money. Does that make sense? So this was not a like forced slavery kind of a thing, but this was a voluntary thing. So it's very similar to like employee-employer relationship that we have even today. Okay. So perhaps this can teach. It taught the people during that time maybe there were Christian owners and Christian slaves, and they were not behaving in a very Christian way. So perhaps
And Paul takes the debt onto his own account.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I think is the big part.
Right, and then for us today, there's some principles there that we can gain from it as well. Yeah. Very nice. Any other questions? Okay, so that was just the exegesis part of it. Okay, I'm just giving you a glimpse of that. Okay, now let's go into the much more difficult thing, which is hermeneutics. Okay. Whose turn? Is it Joshua's turn to read? Okay, go for it.
We come now to what we referred to previously as hermeneutical questions. What do these texts mean to us? At least in exegesis, even if there are disagreements at particular points, most people agree as to the parameters and meaning. There are limitations and possibilities set by the historical and literary context. Paul, for example, cannot have meant something that he and his readers have never heard. However, no such consensus of parameters seems to exist for hermeneutics.
Well, so for example, like we just read Philemon, like we could disagree a little bit about what happened to Onesimus, like why, what happened exactly, because we don't know. But if you like try to argue about, no, this was not written by Paul, like we can't. Why? Because it says right here, like Paul's letter is there. But hermeneutics, which is how does it apply to us today, there's going to be a lot of different things because there's no parameters. Okay, some of you guys might say, well, I think this is the principle that we should learn. And other people might say, no, I don't think that's important anymore. Okay, and so there's going to be, and that's why, again, there's arguments. But again, we have to do proper exegesis first. We have to properly understand what did it mean for the original intended person, which is Philemon, first. And after that, we could do some different hermeneutics. All right, let's keep going. Joshua?
The big issues among Christians committed to the Bible as God's Word has to do with the problems of cultural relativity. What is cultural and therefore belongs to the first century alone, and what transcends culture and is thus a word of all times? Humility. Yeah,
so humility is really, really needed in hermeneutics. Because you go, okay, what is it just for the first century, and how does it apply to us? Again, when it comes to this, if all of us read Philemons together, we're gonna take away something different. And so instead of maybe saying, no, you're wrong and I'm right, maybe we could try to understand each other. Okay? Of course, we could be wrong. We can say your exegesis is wrong. But again, hermeneutics, it becomes more difficult. And so with hermeneutics, we need a lot more humility when it comes to this. The next part, Joseph?
Our hermeneutical differences or difficulties here are several, but they are all related to one issue, a general lack of consistency. This is a great flaw in our common hermeneutics, without necessarily intending to retain our theological heritage, our cultural norms as we read. And this results in all kinds of selectivity of certain passages.
Yeah. So all of us, we talked about this before, we all have some kind of presupposition. Okay, so for some of you guys, you're like, no, woman's right. Most important thing. And so when you read the Bible, you're only going to pick and select what's good for a woman. Some of you guys are like, no, men should dominate the world and every girl should submit. Then what are you going to do? You're going to focus on verses that only highlight that. So we have to be very careful and we have to be very open. Okay, what's the original intent? Instead of bringing my own ideas into the Bible. Okay, and you could just disagree with the Bible if you want, but you can't try to change the meaning of the Bible. Let's keep going. Abby?
For example, most conservative Christians agree with 2 Timothy 2:3, share in suffering as a good soldier of Christ Jesus, but argue with 1 Timothy 5:23. Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. They say that had only to do with Timothy, not with us. But why is this personal word limited to Timothy? The first text is.
Does that make sense? So again, if you want to pick and choose, you go, oh yeah, this is for every single Christian. And then some conservative would say, no, this is only for Timothy. Okay, so again, it seems like you're picking and choosing. Again, you have to do good exegesis then. Okay, so we have to realize every single one of us have tendency to lean this way or lean this way. We already have and this even for pastors, right? Everybody, every single one of us, including myself, we have a tendency to look with our view. Instead, again, that's why exegesis, trying to understand what did it mean? Why did Paul say these things? Okay, that's very important. All right, so let's go over some of the rules for hermeneutics. Again, hermeneutics is what? Study of what it means to us in 2022. Okay, so here's the first rule. Hannah?
You will recall from last week that we set out as a basic rule that the premise that a text cannot mean what it never could have meant to its author or readers. This is why exegesis must always come first. This rule, of course, does not always help one find out what a given passage means, but it does help to set limits as to what it cannot mean.
Right. Okay, so the first rule is, what did it mean for the people in the first century? If it didn't mean something in the first century, that means it doesn't mean that in 2022 either. Okay? So if it didn't mean anything here, it had no relevance to them, then it has no relevance to us today. We'll give you an example of that. Okay? Kev?
For example, the most frequent justification for disregarding the imperatives about seeking spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 14 is a particular interpretation of a preceding moment which states that when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. We are told the perfect has come in the form of New Testament, and therefore the imperfect prophecy and tongues have ceased to function in the church.
Okay? So, I know this is confusing, but let me just give you, for example, like churches like SDA, and there's some other churches as well, they don't believe in speaking in tongues. Okay? So there's different reasons why. But some of them, they say, okay, 1 Corinthians 13, it says here, when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. Okay? And how they interpret that is, when the New Testament comes, then there will be no need for prophecy and tongues anymore. Does that make sense? So they say, oh, you see, in the Bible it says here, we have the New Testament, which is the perfect. And so therefore, you see, prophecy and tongues, like people speaking in different languages and going all crazy. You see, that's done away with. In the first century, so they're basically saying in the first century that was important, but in 2022, there will be no more prophecy and tongues. Does that make sense? Okay, that's an interpretation. That's what they're saying as a hermeneutics. Okay, but what's the problem with this? The problem is this. Next.
But this is one thing the text cannot mean because good
Exegesis.
quite disallows it. There is no way Paul could possibly have meant this. After all, the Corinthians did not know there was going to be a New Testament, and the Holy Spirit would not likely have inspired Paul to write something to them that would be totally incomprehensible.
Okay, does that make sense? So people nowadays, they say, oh, the perfect comes is New Testament. Okay, but again, the original intended people, the Corinthians, they didn't know that perfect was New Testament. Does that make sense? Because there was no New Testament. Okay, so again, you can't just put 2022 ideas onto this text and say, oh, this is what it means. This perfect must mean New Testament. Does that make sense? Okay, because there was no New Testament. So when Paul says when the perfect comes, he's not talking about New Testament. He's talking about something else. What is that something else? Again, there's different interpretations of that. But it cannot be the New Testament because why? New Testament didn't exist during when Paul wrote this letter. Okay, so it cannot mean that. Okay, it has to mean something else. Okay, does that make sense? So that's the principle. The premise is that the text cannot mean what it could not have meant to the author or the readers of that time. Okay, because again, the people back then, they didn't even know that New Testament existed. There was only the Old Testament during that time. The New Testament only occurred 100 years after the original readers of that time.
So when you say we are told the perfect has come, who's telling us that?
When the perfect comes.
Yeah, now the next sentence says, we are told the perfect has come in the form of the New Testament.
Oh, so
Who's
we
telling
as in us,
Yeah, so who's
people
telling
today,
us that?
and then people who want to interpret it this way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
Got it.
So again, this interpretation we would say is wrong, because they're doing their exegesis is wrong altogether. They don't understand what the original listeners heard. Okay, let's keep going. Next. All right, here's the second rule.
The second basic rule is actually a slightly different way of expressing our common hermeneutics. It goes like this: whenever we share comparable particulars, an example, similar specific life situations, with the first century hearers, God's word to us is the same as his word to them.
Okay. Okay. So there's going to be situations in the first century, and it's going to be very similar to us in 2022. Yes, we live in very different culture, but as human beings, there's things that we share. So if it applies to them, then it's going to apply to us today. Same situation. Okay, not comparable, same exact situation, then it's going to be, okay? So we'll give you an example of this. Okay? So again, whenever something in the first century, then it's going to apply to us today. So for example, when the Bible says, honor your mother and father, okay, do we have mother and fathers today? Okay, is it a little bit different, maybe their interaction? Maybe a little bit, but overall, it's the same thing. So we need to still honor our mother and father. We would just say, oh no, that was only for the people in the first century. Okay, things like that. Okay, why? Because they're same exact situation. So here's an example.
For example, like the people of Corinth, we still have local churches, which still have leaders who need to hear the word and take care of how they live in church. It appears that the church has too often been built with wood, hay, and straw rather than gold, silver, and costly stones. And such work, when tried by fire, has been found wanting. We would argue that Paul's warnings about their destroying God's temple, the church, is still God's word to us as to our responsibilities to the local church. It must be a place where the Spirit is known to dwell, and which therefore stands as God's alternative to the sin and alienation of worldliness.
Yeah, so situation with 1 Corinthians is that the people of Corinth, they kept fighting with each other. Okay, they were saying, oh, you like this leader, oh, I like this leader, and they kept fighting. Or you're a Jew, oh, you're a Gentile, they kept fighting over race or about like money, about different things. Okay, Corinthians the church had a lot of issues, and because of that, there was a lot of division. And so Paul's basically saying, again, you're trying to build church with wood and hay and straw. Instead, you need to build it with gold, silver, like as in like good foundation instead of like human foundation. Okay, and then he says here that again, you cannot destroy God's temple. Okay, we're going to talk about this later because most SDAs actually do wrong interpretation and use this as body, like human body. But this has nothing to do with human body. This is talking about the church, if you look at it within the context. Okay? Anyways, so again, this is a very similar situation because in today's church, we have the same issue. So sometimes we fight over, again, not godly things, but human things, human opinions. And again, this thing, again, we have a local church, and we have different people, different opinions, different things, and because of that, they fight. And basically, Paul is warning us too then, in 2022, that we are destroying God's temple if we do that. Okay, so again, that's those are the same exact situation. We might be fighting about something different, but again, if we do that, we're destroying God's temple, which is the church. All right, so again, that's the rule, where if it's the same exact situation, we know that it applies to us today too. Okay, next.
Precaution here is that we do our exegesis well so that we have confidence that our situations in particulars are genuinely comparable to theirs. This is why the careful reconstruction of the problem is so important.
Right. So again, we have to understand what was their problem first very well, so that we can apply to our same problems today. If we don't do this well, if we do this loosely, then we're gonna apply this to all these different situations, and then that might be wrong. So we have to understand what was their first problem, issues, and then do we have something similar today? How can we apply this? Okay. All right, we're out of time and we can't finish. Next week we'll continue on, okay, with the rest of the thing. All right.